This year's online AD talks are digitally bringing together the AD community that is at the heart of the conference's success, growth, and sustainability. The coronavirus outbreak is rapidly changing our planning and orientations as the world is trying to cope with COVID-19 and face its consequences and challenges. At the Policy Center for the New South, we gave our annual Atlantic Dialogues flagship conference a one-year rest while embracing the rapid digitalization brought forth by the pandemic to offer a virtual alternative. This year's online AD talks are digitally bringing together the AD community that is at the heart of the conference's success, growth, and sustainability.
Now it's live.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody, or good evening, wherever you are. My name is Dadush. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm stepping in and a bit at the last moment because the original moderator had a family emergency. And we are going to discuss this crucial topic, I would say, today of COVID-19 and trade. And we have an expert panel from different parts of the world to discuss these issues. Anabel Gonzalez, former Trade Minister of Costa Rica with the Peterson Institute, and Andrea Richter-Garry with the Indiana Development Corporation, and Laoye Jaiyeola with the Nigerian Economic Council. And so they're going to give us perspectives from different parts of the world. Just a minute introduction from me. This COVID crisis has been a terrible event, not just from a health perspective. Over 1.5 million people have died. But also from an economic point of view, as you know well. And world trade in particular has been badly hit. The projections now are that in 2020, world trade will have fallen by about 10% in volume terms compared to 2019, which is, I think, just about the worst in history, probably since the Great Depression. And actually, this is not as bad as people initially thought might happen, because the recovery in economic activity as countries changed their confinement, the policies of confinement, made them more specific and more targeted. The world economy has been recovering faster than people anticipated, beginning in the third quarter of this year. But as you know, countries were already, there was a backlash against trade and against globalization well before the COVID-19 pandemic. And one unfortunate result of the pandemic has been that many policymakers around the world have become party to the view that they should be more self-reliant so as to avoid the disruption in particularly medical products, although there was also concern about the food value chain for a moment. And so different countries have reacted in different ways, but a number of questions have arisen as a result of the pandemic, which is what is the best way to assure a steady supply of products in difficult times, how to respond, how to prepare for the next pandemic, what to do, these sorts of questions. And that's what we're going to discuss in the next hour or so. Let me begin by asking the panel to address a specific question, which is, and we'll begin with Anabel, then go to Andrea and Laoye. None of you, by the way, are forced to answer all the questions. So if you want to skip a question, you can, no problem. And if you want to interject, you can too. So the question I have is, looked at it from your part of the world, how was trade affected? And in particular, how was trade in medical products affected? How did countries respond? Anabel.
So thank you very much, Uri, and hello to everyone. And thank you very much to the Atlantic Dialogues. I'm delighted to be here, and of course to the Policy Center for the New South. Let me start by saying that, Uri, you mentioned that trade had plummeted by about 10%, or it's projected to plummet about 10% in world trade. In the case of Latin America has been hit hardest relative to the world. In the first semester of this year, goods, merchandise exports from Latin America fell by minus 16%, 16%. And unlike the trade contractions, for instance, of the global financial crisis, the main driver of the current crisis was the drop in export volumes. Reduced demand from Latin America's main partners, commodity markets as well. In the case of services trade in the region, moving into the negative for the first time since 2015, with a contraction that is estimated at minus 30% for this year. A big part of it is, of course, travel and tourism. So overall, Latin America very hardly hit, both by the virus, but also its trade, both of goods and merchandise. Now, you ask what kind of trade policies were put in place, in particular to deal with medical goods. And here I have to say that Latin American countries are highly dependent on imports of medical products, as less than 4% of these products are sourced within the region itself. So in the beginning, there was a lot of concern in Latin America with the export curbs that were put in place by almost all of Latin America's most important partners. Now, I think in a way, luckily for the region, the virus came a little bit later to Latin America than it did to the advanced countries. So by the time that the virus started hitting Latin America very strongly, a number of those export restrictions had already been lifted. From that perspective, the region was mostly, I think there are a few exceptions, the region was mostly able to rely on trade to have access to the medical gear that was required to address the pandemic. I mean, it was impacted, like I think everybody else, by the disruptions in transportation. But the timing, I think, element provided a chance for the region as I said, to leverage trade to access the medical gear, the protective equipment that was required.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that overview. Andrea, what happened in Indiana?
Thank you, Yuri, and thank you to my fellow panelists and to the Policy Center for the New South. We're so happy to be here, and as an emerging leader formally of the Atlantic Dialogues, it's great to be back here on this panel, so thank you so much.
You have emerged, Andrea. You have emerged.
Thank you, Yuri. I'm very validated now. I wanted to give folks just a quick background in Indiana. We are a state in the heart of the heartland of the United States, so the area of the Midwest. We have a population of about 6.6 million people. However, if you look at our trade volumes, let's keep it to Latin America, our imports and exports are about the same as a Colombia and a Chile. So if you look at the actual trade volumes we have, they're pretty significant in the world stage. So I think it'll be an interesting discussion today that while we operate under federal policy, right, so we have to respect the tariff policies and the others of our federal government, it's really coming down to the state to still build international trade relationships and those business-to-business relationships in our key sectors. So it's been a very interesting dynamic. So how that translated to the pandemic is we saw different industries affected in different ways. So we are actually one of the most heavily concentrated states in the US of advanced manufacturing. 1 in 5 people here are employed in the manufacturing industry. So you saw some of our industries like steel, our whole automotive supply chain. We have 5 OEMs here, hit incredibly hard, right, with the export volumes that were coming out of that. However, if you saw some of our imports, we also have a huge life sciences industry. So medical products, medical devices, and even our agricultural industry, you saw some of our exports not necessarily decrease, but also even in some cases increase. So it was a very different balance when we look at our state economy of how industries were affected differently. So our policy programming had to kind of, not be a one size fit all in order to how we navigate that. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the medical piece of it and how kind of U.S. states had just some autonomy in doing that. So as you can probably hear, what happened is there was a shortage, of course, of PPE across the whole world. And while the federal government supplemented some of our supplies, it was up to US states to really go out and ensure that they had the medical products for the safety and security of their populations. So we had to take an all, kind of an all-faceted approach. So we went to a couple things. One was, of course, leaning on our national and international partners. So we are a state that has put a lot of priority the last 4 years into building our international bridges. We've actually tripled our FDI and expanded our international presence. So we were working closely with countries like Singapore, of course, China, countries in Europe to import as much as we could. But that was not going to fill the gap during this time. So we actually put money and policies towards retooling of some factories. So advanced manufacturers who maybe used to make auto supply parts could now make certain pieces of ventilators. So we had a GM facility making ventilators. We had a great company called Indiana Face Mask. They received a grant from the state, and they just became one of the only, I think, 5 or 6 entities in the country to produce N95, certified N95 masks. We had chemical companies who could make hand sanitizers. So we had to really, in those short periods, retool our factories to do that. So it was retooling, it was expanding our international and domestic partnerships, and trying to really just cobble together the best response that we could when it came to medical devices. So luckily, because of our manufacturing background, we were in a better place than many other states because we had the tools and the knowledge to make things, but not every state had that same starting point. So it was a very interesting time period, and one that I hope that we have learned from here in the United States.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrea. Laoye, tell us about Nigeria, the experience in Nigeria.
Well, again, let me thank the Policy Center for inviting me. And I think our experience is slightly similar to what Anabel said. Generally, we are a heavily import-dependent nation. And the only thing we really export was really crude oil. And at a time when when GDP was plummeting, economy was going down, we all knew what happened to the price of crude oil. It was again falling significantly. So you realize that we weren't doing much in terms of export, but even when it came to imports, it was difficult to have any import. And one of the things we noticed during the pandemic was that there were supply disruptions. So even if you had wanted to import any medical equipment for the purposes of the people locally, you were not going to get it anywhere, because nations then, most of the nations looked inside and they were concerned about how to take care of their citizenry over and above everyone. So what you saw was that we had a situation when trade was affected. Unfortunately, trade even within Africa had always been around 3% within Africa, and it further went down in the course of that of the pandemic. Again, owing to restrictions. I mean, once planes were not going to fly, there were border restrictions all over the place. People just sat where they were, and because you again needed people to stay where they were to avoid the virus spreading, you realize that trade was significantly disrupted. But again, what did we do in Nigeria, realizing that, well, you're not going to get most of this import anyway? First and foremost, what I think the government did was to say all taxes, all levies on import, medical imports were waived. So, totally suspended to allow that, to ensure that people were attended to. If you happen to get any of these things, any of these goods imported, at least that was that waiver. And because companies were going through a lot of problems, all that they did at that point was to ensure that there were tax reductions and tax freezes. So you can defer your tax returns to ensure that you at least had cash flow sufficiently to manage yourself during that period. But one thing that was interesting was that we then were forced to do some kind of import substitutions. So people had to look, if you're going to do some equipment that we cannot import, how can we look back and do some backward integration? And the good enough is that it forced a lot of our research institutes to begin to look inward and to see how can we ensure that in future instances, we're not going to be caught up like this, where supply chains, when you have supply chain disruption. So in terms of trade, it affected us significantly. That's not to say that it arose as a result of the pandemic. We're already beginning to see some slowing down in the economy before then. But what that pandemic did was that it just exacerbated it. It made it a lot wider and bigger for us. And those lockdowns affected people. But again, there were other trade-related issues. Now if I go to when you lock down a nation that a number of people that work are either employed by themselves, they are MSMEs, and you shut all those on down, it has implication for not only for their head, it has significant economic implications. And that, of course, led to some security issues. So government didn't have any choice but to look at how do we get palliative to all these areas. So in general, trade was affected, volume went down, but what it did was for us to begin to look at how do we build our own medical supplies? What do we do to ensure that there's effective medical supply subsequently? So those are the few things that happened. These are my initial interjections. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Before I go to the next set of questions, let me ask Andrea and Anabel, in the regions you're familiar with, were there export controls? For example, in Indiana, did you try and stop, and could you in fact stop exports of critical materials you felt were important to deal with the pandemic? And Anabel, are you aware of export controls in Latin America? Andrea, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'd say not in a formal way. So when we look at kind of the mandate between federal policy and state policy, the state doesn't have as many tools to use that right in our state. I would say kind of informally, we as a state government took a proactive approach to try to secure contracts of key manufacturing pieces. So when we would supply grants to different companies to maybe retool? How did we then put in place long-term contracts with these entities in our state to make sure that enough of that product stayed in our state? So no, not a formal policy barring exports, but how did we proactively make sure that enough products stayed before the difference, would go to other parts of the country or the world?
Good, good. Anabel, any views there?
So in Latin America, when initially, what most governments try to do, they try to, get access to this critical medical supplies. So first they sort of lowered tariffs and tried to get access to as many supplies as they could. And then they instituted export bans to avoid those products being re-exported. But then they realized that that didn't make any sense, because really in Latin America, as in Africa, it was a question of, how can you leverage trade to access those goods? Because yes, there was retooling in a number of places. A few countries do have some capacity for these products, but the reality was for the region that, either they were able to access the goods from China, from the US, from Europe, because again, the production is highly concentrated in some of these places, or else they would not be able to access the medical gear that was required. So at the end of the day, most countries in the region, ended up by removing the duties, the taxes, or suspending tariffs. They instituted expedited customs procedures and border clearance to facilitate the movement of these products. They enhanced regulatory approval and cooperation on standards for traded goods. And now, as we know, we're still not out of the pandemic. So a major question for a lot of countries in the region is, well, now that the vaccine is coming, of course, access to the vaccine is one question, but even when you have access to the vaccine, the logistics, distribution, and transportation services associated with the vaccine, and I'm sure in Africa is the same thing, it's quite a challenge as well. So, for this part of the world, I think it has become very clear the value of trade and the relationship in this case between trade and saving lives.
Laoye, let me ask you, what's the plan in Nigeria for the vaccine?
Well, again, we are heavily dependent on, I know that dependent on support from multilateral agencies and some foundations. And part of what we're hearing is that through Gavi and a few other institutions, they will make sure that very early in the new year, there can be some vaccines for Nigeria. That's the arrangement. But we know that, of course, given what every part of the world is decided to do, critical areas that are under significant pressures will have more attention than other areas. And well, coincidentally, the number of fertilities in Nigeria is not as high as anticipated or predicted due to a couple of things. Again, like Anabel did say, you realize that the problem didn't started in the developed nations, and before they could come down to Nigeria, we've had to shut down borders and do a lot of controls, which helped to ensure that we didn't have significant spread. And given the fact that the Lagos states where we had our initial gates had an experience dealing with Ebola before, and they had a structure in place to handle such disease, they could bring it under control. So that's the thing. But in terms of vaccine, we're looking forward to some of these foundations and multilateral agencies to see how we can secure. But I'm aware that discussions are all to make sure we have in January.
Great, thank you. So let's shift the focus now to the future. The kinds of policy responses that you would advise based on your experience, your policymakers to prevent, in the event of another pandemic, the sort of panic and the effect on particularly medical products, the availability of medical products. I want to talk a little bit about that, about the future in that way. Then later, we're going to broaden our discussion a bit. Before I get into the specifics, let me ask you a general question. Do you think one can fully ensure or prepare for a future pandemic? Is it possible for us to be fully prepared next time something like COVID-19 strikes? Who wants to go first?
Okay, when you talk about fully prepared, an emphasis on fully, we cannot all be fully prepared for anything that is uncertain. We don't know the timing, we know it will come. However, there are a number of things that we can do about preparedness. I mean, and one thing is sure, that so long as we don't talk to each other regularly all over the world, there will be problem like this will arise. We need to strengthen some of our agencies that have the responsibility for coordination and build confidence in them, and ensure that whatever it is we need to do to at least anticipate and reasonably plan for such pandemic, we do, as not only as nations, but as collaborating together as a world. Because the truth of the matter is that pandemic is come to stay. If it is not COVID today, it's going to be another one tomorrow. But what lessons are we learning about coordination and cooperation? And some of us have the belief that if we had coordinated very well and then worked together very well, maybe the scale of infection will have been reduced. But one is glad to know that whilst we didn't have government coordinating, we saw some semblance of coordination among private sector firms and institutions, which is why, I mean, having these vaccine at a record time, it's a record time discovery. And that spoke to the coordination that took place among the private sector people. So we cannot fully prevent it, but we can effectively mitigate the impact by working together and coordinating our activities.
And Andrea, what do you think? Do you think we can fully prepare? I mean, I asked this question because, you know, the political dialogue around the world is always to blame the policymakers and say, look what a mess we're in. You know, why can't you guys anticipate what's going on? How is it you are incompetent? What's your response to that, Andrea? Anabel, go ahead,
You're
Andrea.
right. We all wish we had our crystal balls. But you know, my short answer is of course no, which, like you said, is not a popular answer to the populations we serve. But in all seriousness, I think to echo some of the previous panelists is yes, there are really important things that we can do. So of course we can do some of the short-term planning for a pandemic with the medical research and stockpiling and all the things that we know would be needed for a response to the pandemic. But I think it was more important to us as a state, and where we really were able to hang on, was some of our long-term planning. So if we hadn't have thought through things 5-10 years ago to keep us in the place we are now, we wouldn't have been able to respond. So I'm talking about some of our fiscal climate. So we were actually a state that, because of policy choices and balanced budget, we had about 2.3 billion in cash reserves in our state government that we were able to draw on for, we call it a rainy day fund, and it was pouring this last year. And also I wanted to touch on workforce. So I know that maybe sometimes we don't talk as much about trade and workforce, but we have actually put a huge emphasis on workforce training policies. So what happened is, we had a large population who were not kind of skilled up for different industries, right? So we put a lot of money towards training, education, and also flexibility for employers to train. So when we saw this shift between industries in the last year, so maybe someone who was in advanced manufacturing that has to move to something else, maybe someone who was in the hospitality industry who had to move to a different field. We had the tools and the programs already in place. We didn't have to create them, so they could pivot to a different industry, which then increased our ability to export and to see thriving industries. So my bigger thing would be, you need to have kind of the long-term strategy in place, and also the long-term relationship. So we've had a governor who has traveled probably more than any previous governor. So we have been to Asia, to Europe, to South America, all these different places so that when we needed to pick up the phone and call to say, how do we, leverage some of our trade products, we had that already. And that is, I think, unique. And not every US state or every subnational city, state has those types of relationships. So my emphasis would be, how do you put the things in place now that maybe aren't necessarily pandemic related, but are just good sense for trade and business? And that would be my takeaway from this whole experience.
Anabel?
So I would say that aside from measures that governments need to take, at the national level, I think that there are two things that could help us be better prepared, because I agree both with Laoye and Andrea that, of course, one can never be fully prepared for something like this. The first is increased transparency at the global level of what is going on. Because I think that a lot of the initial, export curves that we saw came out of concern that nobody knew really, what products were out there. And I remember when there was the food crisis in 2007 and 2008, where there were a lot of export restrictions instituted on wheat and rice, and that had a very detrimental effect on prices and food security and other stuff. And as a result of that crisis, there's a system that was created to monitor information on key agricultural products. And if you look at this crisis in particular, COVID-19, as you said, there were a little bit of food restrictions that were established in the beginning, but immediately I think that governments basically lifted those restrictions. Most governments did, because they understood that the information was available out there, and they saw that there was enough food, and that the issue was not access to food, but other things. So in the area of medical gear, having more information about manufacturing, what's out there, I think is something that could be useful. The other point that I want to make is that I think that no country can produce, not even a large continent, say like Europe, can produce everything that would be required in the pandemic. In the first place, because we don't know what would be required in the next pandemic. We may think a few basic things. Yes, we know we're going to need masks. We need masks for everything. But aside from that, are we going to need respirators? And do every country, does every country in the world now start producing respirators and stockpiling them? That wouldn't make any sense in my view. So again, I think we need to understand that leveraging trade is a very important element of preparedness for the next crisis. So I think we need to come together, countries need to come together in the context of the World Trade Organization, all of them if possible, if not those that are willing to do so, and to enter into an agreement on trade and health, which will basically include some of the things that we were mentioning before that governments were doing. Things like removing duties, taxes, other charges, limited resort and use of export restrictions, expedited customs procedures, the enhanced regulatory approvals, maybe even, thinking about how can you liberalize services, logistics, distribution services in case of an emergency, improved access and movement of essential personnel, because we even hear, say, in some states in the US, they now have the gear, but they don't have the people to operate those respirators. So at the end of the day, we need to figure out how do we put together a stronger framework, a trade framework, that will help us be better prepared when the next pandemic arrives.
Sorry, there's a background noise, which is why I'm muting all the time. Let me ask, just go for the jugular, so to speak, the key question. If you compare policies of self-reliance, okay? So a lot of stockpiling and a lot of domestic production with policies of relying on international trade. Many countries have decided that they need to do more at home, self-reliance, including in the United States and including in Morocco, for example. What would you say, Laoye, Andrea, Anabel, to those who think that it's really increased self-reliance and stockpiling that is needed compared to trade. Let's start with Laoye.
Thank you very much. There's no doubt that globalization has made the world richer and better. But in recent time, you've seen people come to say, look, what has it done? Because their belief is that only the top 10 very rich people, wealthy people, have taken advantage of globalization. A lot of people felt left behind. And so when you tell them the benefit of, depending on the world trade, globalization, they will tell you, no, we lost our job, we lost our home, we lost everything. It is important that no matter what type of policy we pursue, whether self-reliance within inside or doing trade, there are certain basic provisions that we must do in taking care of those that are vulnerable, but it must be left behind. And so you find out that the populism and all the things you saw that arose in pre-COVID arose out of the sense of those who felt left behind. And they felt that migrants, foreigners, people have been responsible for why they've lost what they've lost. And so you then saw people that came and said, my nation first, myself first, internal first. Secondly, one of the things that came clearly to us in the face of the pandemic was that everybody wanted to protect their citizen before any other persons. And therefore you saw some level of patriotism looking at ourselves first. So what I would say is it's not either or. I am a firm believer in globalization, but for those of us that believe in world trade and globalization, to still be able to speak, we must ensure that we take care of the vulnerables and those left behind. Otherwise, there will be increased backlash about reaching out to everybody in the world.
Thank you. Thank you. Andrea, what do you think? Self-reliance versus trade?
No, I agree with Laoye. I think it's not mutually exclusive, and we wouldn't be successful if we took just a hardline approach, one way or the other. So, why we wanted to continue to expand our global connections. I mean, this was important to bring in certain aspects of our supply chain to keep those alive. If you look at what drives policymakers, we were just talking about how you, please the population that you serve. It wouldn't be pragmatic to say that they're not going to be responsive to their local populations. Our governors, our legislatures, they are elected to protect the people in their state. And that's whether on a world level or a national level, that is who they're responsible for. So I think to say that there can't be some element of self-reliance in policy would be naive. So when hospitals are filling, they have to be responsive to that to make sure that people can be taken care of in that way. So I think it will continue to happen. I think, states or subnational have to be reliant on the assets that they have. So whether it's their production, whether it's what they can grow, whether it's, we had a National Guard who was mobilized to be able to do all of our transportation logistics. So when Anabel was talking about, it's not just about getting a vaccine or getting certain products, it's what's the whole, value system of making sure that's possible. You have to be creative in the resources that your state has. So I think there is an element of self-reliance that will need to be there and that will always be there because that is how you be responsive to your citizens.
You're mute, Uri. Uri, I'm sorry, you're mute.
Andrea, question for you from the audience. If you were the US trade representative in the new Biden administration, would you push for more deals, including in the medical area? Or would you say, we need to keep our America first policies.
This is getting into dangerous territory, so I'm definitely taking off my official hat here at state government. But no, I think it'll be very interesting to see what the new administration does. And I think to Anabel's previous point, there does have to be an emphasis and use of some of these international organizations. I think while American ingenuity and some of our research universities and some of our policy measures like the Defense Production Act will make sure that the United States has the supplies that they need, it would be naive to think that we couldn't work with others to leverage some of those assets. You can't just go overnight to being a self-reliant nation. I don't think that's a practical piece that many people hold anymore. So I think there would definitely be the appetite for re-engaging with Europe, with Asia, other continents to try to see how can we specifically have these targeted industry specific ones. So maybe not broader trade agreements, maybe they are just very curated, in medical devices or in pharmaceuticals or other areas would be an initial first step to broker these agreements.
Anabel, for you, the same question on self-reliance versus trade, but there's also a question from the audience. Do you believe we're in globalization? Do you believe that globalization is slowing and permanently? And will the pandemic just exacerbate this trend?
So I think, Uri, on your first question, I think there is really no rationale for governments to push for deglobalization or reshoring. Trying to lessen the dependence on global value chains would put the world population at risk by reducing access to these essential supplies or by making them significantly more expensive. One thing is to ramp up manufacturing capacity, and I think that should happen all around the world. But a very different thing is to think that self-reliance is the way to go. Because for the majority of countries in the world, in the case of, for instance, of the medical gear that is required to fight the pandemic, the only way they can provide for their citizens is if they can leverage the manufacturing capacity of the rest of the world. So this is why this is so important. And since we don't know what the next pandemic will bring, we don't know whether we will need these respirators or we will need dialysis machines or we will need, something else that we cannot even think what it is today. So I think we need to be very careful and we need to have strong frameworks to support us to be able, to provide for people in the context of the pandemic. And this is why I am such a firm believer in the need for an international framework on trade and health that would allow, and to the point that Laoye was making, in the sense of making sure that you provide for the people who need it the most, and that you leave no one behind. This framework is absolutely key to make sure that is the case. Now, to your point about whether we're moving in the direction of globalization, or I think it's more like globalization is changing, and we have not discussed here, but one very impressive development in the context of the pandemic is the push towards the digital economy. And we know that all of this was happening before, for sure, but none of us would be engaged today in a virtual event like this one that we're having, coming from different parts of the world, if it were not for the pandemic, even though the technology was available before. And like that, this has happened in so many areas, in education, in health, in so many others, that, in a way, you can say that globalization is moving more from the goods realm to the services realm, and increased flows of data, they've just exploded in the context of the pandemic. So I do think that globalization, one, is very resilient, Two, it morphs, it changes as as the economy evolves. For sure, government policies can impact globalization, and some of the policies that we have seen before the pandemic, were very detrimental to the future of global value chains, for example. But I think in going forward, I am an optimist, and I think that one thing that the world can learn from this experience is that we're better off working together than each one going on its own.
Laoye, a question for you from the audience. If we had the African continental free trade area in actual operation today, okay? If the agreement had been sealed and signed and we had free trade in Africa today, would we be better able to deal with the pandemic?
Well, and I'm glad that we've done that. Hopefully, it will increase trade within Africa from 3% where it is now, largely. Now, but what is important is that you still need some level of support, infrastructure. And we talk about, and when you listen to what Anabel said, there are some areas that have expertise and have built competencies in terms of manufacturing those value chains that we need to live and work with. For instance, trade will not work well if the infrastructure is poor. One of the major problems in Africa has been infrastructure in Africa. Meeting from one place to Africa. So it's good that we've signed it. If we've signed it and it just remains a paper, nothing will have happened. But if you signed it and then taking steps to ensure that we attract the much needed investment in the area of infrastructure, connectivity, enhancing our significant value chain, backward integration, we will have done a lot more. But signing is the first step. There is a lot that we can do. So even if we had it and we haven't done all those things we needed to have done, have to make it. But going forward, doing all that we do will prepare us better for.
Okay, you were breaking up, Laoye, but I think we got the main point, which is the African Continental Free Trade Area will certainly help us deal with shortages, make us more efficient, but it needs to be accompanied by investment in infrastructure. I think that was the main point. So that's good. One question for all of you. It's striking how quickly we got to the vaccine. And question is, and also the number of promising therapies, although we're not doing quite as well there. Question for you is, how important do you think it was to have international collaboration in scientific and medical research in order to get us to this point as quickly as we have? Does anybody want to take that?
Well, I can just say a couple of words there, because it is indeed amazing that the vaccine was developed in this short period of time. Most vaccines can take up to 10 years to be developed. And one of the elements of success in terms of the rapid deployment of the vaccine was precisely that collaboration within the scientific community. So I think, the vaccine, we needed collaboration for the vaccine to be developed. We need collaboration for the vaccine to be manufactured, because manufacturing of vaccines only takes place within a few countries around the world. It cannot be produced everywhere. And we need collaboration to make sure that the vaccine reaches everyone across the world. So it goes to my point that, when we are confronted with such enormous challenges as those brought upon by the pandemic, collaboration at all levels is absolutely critical.
If I can jump in there for a minute, Ari, I think I think it is, a great case study of that. I mean, if you look at the U.S., I mean, the role that we can play in pharmaceutical development because of the role of the private company here in the United States and the money and the resources that they have and the global reach. I mean, if you look at a Pfizer, which is going through, I think the FDA panel just greenlit the vaccine and hopefully will have full approval soon. Their partnership with BioNTech, which is a German or Turkish German in background company. I mean, those are the types of partnerships where you had the idea and the research, but the weight of a large pharmaceutical company that has global reach in the US to be able to make that possible in such a short period of time. Here in Indiana, we are actually home of Eli Lilly, the pharmaceutical company. So they had a drug, remdesivir, which is actually one of the therapeutics. So to your point, I wish there was more on the therapeutic side. But again, this is harnessing some of the ingenuity, the research, the private sector money in collaboration with the public sector in order to get these drugs to market quicker. So I think that is important to underscore that collaboration is needed, but that the role of the private sector can play.
Let me say that a critical step, of course, was the decoding of the genetic makeup of the virus, which the Chinese researchers did also in record time. It used to take months and months to do this. They did it in a few days or weeks. And then I read that actually the vaccine by BioNTech and by Moderna, they were able to produce the vaccine that has been tested subsequently within a few days, following the decoding of the genetic makeup of the virus. And then all the rest of the time has been, of course, testing it, which is very, very complicated. Let me ask you this. So when you look at this terrible experience, this terrible, terrible event of the pandemic, has anything good come out of it? Would you like to comment on it? I mean, is there anything positive we take out of this experience for the future? Laoye, do you want to start?
Number one, digital. The new basis of collaboration is moved significantly. I mean, ordinarily we all have been at Marrakesh now, but now you in US, everywhere we're talking and we're having a program. It's going to enhance the work-life balance, how people work, education. So the role of the digital world and how it is shaped trade is important. The second thing we found out, and again, commenting on what had happened around how we were able to get the vaccine, is that look, no matter how much we try to look inward, it's about collaboration and cooperation. And when people work and collaborate together, a lot will happen. The third thing that is clear to me is that no matter how rich you are as a nation, unless you support collaboration, things, the kind of security threats we are facing all over the world today, it's something that is very pervasive and all around. So it's whether it's cyber, whether it's in collaboration in dealing with. Those are my 3 points that I
Good. Anabel, you want to take that up?
Well, I mean, I think it goes without saying that it's been and continues to be a terrible tragedy. But I do think that some of the points that Laoye was making are right on point, really, in the sense that this move towards the digital economy and the possibilities that this opens around the world, I think it's something very, very positive. It has also, I think, exposed that the challenges that are associated and how much, policies and investments would be required to make sure that, the digital economy simply does not deepen some of the inequalities that were there before. But from the perspective of opening new opportunities, I think this is probably one of the most important things that has resulted out of this pandemic. The second one is, and I think that the narrative in the beginning was that we need to just close our borders and make sure that we produce what we need. I think the evidence is coming out now from the first 6-7 months of the pandemic, and it is showing that actually trade is a very important part of the solution to a pandemic. So I think that with the benefit of time, that narrative that was there at the beginning will change significantly, and we will understand the importance of trade to helping fight events like this. So I would say those are two things that I think we can learn from this pandemic.
Andrea, so from the standpoint there in Indiana, anything positive come out of this terrible event?
No, thank you for the question. And it has been hard. It's hard to see your communities ravaged and to see, families lose people. I think in my mind, it has really highlighted the importance of small business and the backbone that is to our economy versus some of the large corporations. When we talk about trade at these very macro levels, well, what is at the end of the day? It's making business to business connections. It's someone who makes a widget here in Indiana who connects with a distributor in Morocco to get their goods to that market and to make that. And I think sometimes when we look maybe at a smaller level, so much of our economy is these small businesses who make our economy run, who produce, this company who I'm saying made the N95 masks, and one of only in the country. They're a small business in Rensselaer, Indiana. So how do we give these businesses and highlight the importance of them in our economy? How do we give them the resources, the grants, the support, the policy support to make sure they thrive? Because that is the backbone of trade. It's not just some of these, mega deals and things like that. I mean, those numbers come from somewhere. So I think to show how important small businesses are, it'll be something that that policymakers really need to take note of. And I hope that will ultimately strengthen our economies and overall trade relationships going forward.
Very good. Well, look, I think we're drawing to a close. I'm going to say a word at the very end, but I want to give our panelists the chance to make any concluding remarks, something maybe we haven't covered, or something that you want to leave as a main point for our audience. Laoye, do you want to go first?
Thank you very much, Uri. I mean, this pandemic has taught us quite a few things that I think we must bear in mind. That no one is an island. And as a world, we need to work more collaboratively to deal with the challenges and the problems that we are facing and that we're going to face. I mean, the second thing I've learned is that nothing is ever permanent. We will continually reinvent and rediscover, and things are going to change. And therefore, we should always be prepared to deal with the changes. Those two will be my points that I want to leave behind.
Very good. Andrea?
Thank you, Uri. Well, I think in addition to Laoye's very poignant first point about no one being an island, I think that matters very much for subnational relationships too. And I know in these broader discussions, it becomes very impersonal with kind of country policies and broader global policies, but what cities, what states, what communities are doing, all impact this. And I think it's just important to know that there isn't a uniform approach, even across states, even across countries. And how do we have those communities work together as well? And how do we still have an appropriate role for the autonomy of subnational actors to be able to affect these global trends? So I would just leave that to still have policymakers and think tanks and others look at these issues, because it is important what different U.S. states are doing, or what different cities may be doing in order to build international relationships and to navigate this global trade environment.
Anabel, concluding points.
So it's been a great discussion. Thank you very much to you, Uri, Andrea, and Laoye. Maybe what I'd like to say is that, we are all hopeful, I think, at this point, that the vaccines provide a much welcome light at the end of the tunnel. We're not there yet, but I think we are hopeful. But we know that other crises will come, and that the cost of being ill prepared are high. I think there's a risk also that trade frictions and geopolitical rivalry may cloud the judgment, or that the alternative narrative may be leveraged to try to redraw, the map of supply chains and enter into sort of geopolitics. So my message is that concerted action is needed, I think, to reignite trade cooperation and avoid increased distortions and disruptions to global value chains and spillover effects into other realms.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you, all of you, for a very good discussion. What do I take away, or what message would I leave? Of course, I've worked on these issues. I was supposed to be a speaker on this panel, not the moderator. And let me say, my big message is global problems, global solutions. I like no man is an island. What do we mean, global problem, global solution? Pandemics are global problems. To prevent a pandemic, you need global cooperation. You need to be able to monitor, anticipate, make sure that the measures are in place in the markets, et cetera, so that the pandemic doesn't break out in the first place. And then in order to respond to a sudden new virus, and it is always a new terrible virus or something like that that emerges, you need a tremendous amount of thinking done in a very short period. And that requires the best brains in the world to get together and communicate and come up with a plan, which is what happened in the case of the vaccine. And then in order to respond with goods and services that are needed, part of it, of course, is the capacity of individual regions and nations. But the other big part is the huge flexibility and efficiency that you get from being part of a global system of supply, which, however, has to respond in a rational way, which is why Anabel's point about disciplines at the global level, WTO, et cetera, are very, very important. And then in responding ultimately to actually with the therapeutics and the vaccines that are needed, you need a global logistics chain, which just now we are beginning to unfold right now at this point. And this requires cooperation across 200 countries, okay? So that's the message. Global problem, global solutions. I want to bring it to a close. Thank you very much, Laoye from Nigeria. I'm in Washington myself. Andrea from Indiana. And Anabel, where are you? Costa Rica?
I'm in Costa Rica today. That's right.
All right. And to our friends at the Policy Center, where I'm a senior fellow, I should have said, thank you very much for organizing it. And all the best to you. Bye.
The coronavirus outbreak is rapidly changing our planning and orientations as the world is trying to cope with COVID-19 and face its consequences and challenges. At the Policy Center for the New South, we gave our annual Atlantic Dialogues flagship conference a one-year rest while embracing the rapid digitalization brought forth by the pandemic to offer a virtual alternative. This year's online AD talks are digitally bringing together the AD community that is at the heart of the conference's success, growth, and sustainability.